Hey guys, so before we went on break, we left off talking about waves, tides, and coastlines. Now we're going to jump into our new unit, which is going to be on marine ecology. So these notes are just doing a basic overview and kind of review of a lot of stuff we've already learned so far. That's all going to kind of come together and explain this marine ecology. At the beginning of the year, if you can remember, the literal first thing that we learned about was a lot of vocab that had to do with marine ecology, such as ecology, ecosystem, biotic and abiotic factors, habitat, populations, communities. So we're going to be revisiting a lot of that information as well as marine zones and seeing how it all fits together. So to start with, each organism is structurally, chemically, or behaviorally adapted for a particular habitat and occupies a particular niche. All right, and the ocean supports a great diversity of life and ecosystems. So what this means, structurally, we've talked about organisms that have adaptations such as swim bladders to help them float and beat the odds of all that deep pressure. Structurally and chemically together, organisms that could do photosynthesis differ. Behavioral, we have dolphins, for instance, that live in our pelagic zone because they are very social organisms. So to live in that open water is, compared to coastal areas, is very important to them. All right, so the ocean is going to support this vast amount of great diversity, okay? Major marine habitats are divided into two groups. So these two groups we've already visited with our marine zones. So the first one is the pelagic zone, which, if you remember, pelagic is open ocean at any depth. All right, so it's the largest life zone. This is where we find lots of schools of fish, pods of marine animals. All right, so it's a photic zone, photic meaning there's light, containing plankton and nekton. These are two new terms to us. So plankton is anything that is floaters in the water. All right, they just float around. Where nekton is considered anything that swims or has some type of movement that they can control. All right, so plankton, they float around with the currents. Nekton, they have some type of control over how they get around or swim. And then when we talk about our neritic and oceanic zones, all right, so remember with our ocean zones, it could be the distance from shore, available sunlight, or water depth to describe it. Okay, so our pelagic and benthic zones are used to describe water at any depth. Our neritic and oceanic are talking about the distance from shore, and then when we get to aphotic there, that's where we're talking about available sunlight. So our neritic zone is our coastal areas. All right, so remember, neritic is just that top open ocean. All right, and our oceanic zone is that open water. All right, when we think of the vast blue deep sea, we're thinking of the oceanic zone. The benthic zone. All right, so this is the benthic zone. All right, this is the lowest level of a body of water, considered the bottom. Okay, so if we think back, the benthic zone refers to ocean bottom at any depth or distance from shore. All right, it includes the sediment surface and subsurface layers of our ocean floor, and organisms that live here are called benthos. Okay, so they are referred to as benthos organisms because they are living either on that sediment surface, so the sediment being sand, rock, gravel, or they're living inside of it, all right, like worms. So this could be our aphotic zone or our abyssal plain. So dark and barren is where a lot of the benthic zone, but remember, it could be at any depth or distance from shore. Our two major marine habitats, the pelagic and benthic zone, are occupied by 5 levels of biota. And from our vocabulary, we know that biota is any type of living organism, all right? It can be an animal or plant life, a particular region, habitat, or geological period. So to get started with, our first one is the individual, all right? So one plant or animal of a species, all right? So we have plankton. Plankton are organisms that cannot make a forward motion against a current, okay? So these were our floaters, like we just talked about before when we talked about in our pelagic zone. We have phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic producers in our food chain, all right? So they're the ones that are going to be using that light energy to make food. And then we have zooplankton, which are primary consumers. So they're going to eat the phytoplankton, All right, so you can remember which one is which. Think photosynthesis or photosynthetic, they have the pH. Phytoplankton also have the pH, so that goes together. All right, so phytoplankton make their own food. Zooplankton are our primary consumers that are going to come in and eat the phytoplankton. All right. Another example we have is nekton, which we just talked about as well. Those are swimming animals. All right, so fish, mammals, birds, reptiles. Yes, birds can swim in water. Okay, so that would be our nekton. Then we have our benthos, which we just touched on for the benthic zone. All right, so these are bottom dwellers. So these are the organisms that are going to live either in the subsurface layers of the sediment or on top of the sediment surface on the bottom of the ocean floor. We have epifauna, all right, so these are organisms that are going to walk on the substrate, all right, or on the sand at the ocean bottom. So crabs are epifauna. Or we have infauna, and they live in the substrate or the sand. So an example would be worms. So that's easy to remember as well, the difference between the two. Epi, think epidermis, which is your skin. Your skin is on the outside of your body, all right? So epi, they're walking on the outside of the substrate. Infauna, all right, it starts with in. So they live in the substrate. Then we have our demersal, all right? And these organisms are ones that hover, swim, or rest, okay? So they live and feed on or near the bottom of the ocean, which usually consists of that mud, sand, gravel, and rocks. So that's why our examples of that would be a flounder, a skate, which is a type of fish, or a ray, all right? Then lastly, for our individuals, we have sessile organisms. And sessile organisms are attached in one place, and they are immobile, meaning they do not move. Once they are there, they are there. All right, and this is our barnacles and different types of sponges. All right, so they latch on and live out their life on whatever substrate that they have attached themselves to. Our next level of biota is our population. So remember, a population is two or more individuals of the same species that are competing for resources in their habitat because they inhabit the same niche. All right, so DNA and how that in the 1970s is when we really just discovered how we can look at DNA and identify it and code it. All right, so DNA studies are used to identify which individuals are part of a population. And in doing so, we have learned a lot about different organisms and realizing the ones that we thought were closely related are not whatsoever. But also that our tree of life is very diverse and it's ever changing as we find these new advances in science, which is pretty cool. Populations are measured by a thing called population density. All right, so this is the number of individuals divided by the size of the habitat. So what that means is that we are looking at the number of individuals per unit of an area. So typically, we're talking about humans, the area is a square mile. But when we're talking about any type of marine organisms or plant life, we use a term called a horticulture. And again, it is a set distance from one another. But all that is we're looking at how many are in that area divided by the actual size so we can figure out how dense the population is, all right? This population density, though, is affected by geography, seasonal factors, pollution, and birth-to-death ratio based on the number of adults. All right, so a lot of things come into play when we're looking at population density and the size of a population based on what type of year it is, based on seasonal factors. So if there was a hurricane, based on if there's some type of pollution that's causing more individuals to die at birth rather than live long lives as adults. All right, so a lot of things go into our populations. Our third level of biota is a community. So remember, a community is two or more populations living within a habitat that occupy different niches. All right. So community living has an advantage by reducing competition, all right, and increasing variety and diversity. So competition is reduced because these organisms are in different niches. They're not having to do the same job or use the same resources, okay? The general niches are producers, consumers, and decomposers, which we've already talked about when we talked about food webs and energy flow. So our producers, as we already talked about, our primary producers are phytoplankton, all right? They start all food, marine food chains at the top. Then we have our consumers. They could be primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, all right? These are herbivores, so they are just eating algae and plants. Carnivores, which are eating other organisms, or omnivores, which most humans are. We eat both plants and animals. All right, so consumers are going to eat others. And then lastly, we have our decomposers. So these are all of our scavengers, all right? And decomposers, they break down organic compounds into nutrients for producers to use and start the cycle all over again. An important thing to note about communities is that communities age in a process called biological succession. So they can change over time, all right? And our three main phases of this biological succession is a pioneer, a juvenile, and a mature community, okay? So a pioneer community would be the first populations move into a habitat. All right, so this could be polychaete worms moving in and starting the basis of a coral reef system or something like that. Then we have juvenile, so baby fish come in, so it's a young population, and there is a very simple food chain going on. So you have a primary producer, a primary consumer, probably a secondary, but not much more than that. It's very, very basic. But over time, it evolves into a very mature community, all right? So older communities. So we go from populations to actual communities, so there's more than one species there, with complex food webs or chains, stable populations, and this is where we have natality equals mortality. So natality is at the birth rate equals the death rate, meaning that this community is able to support whatever organisms are living there. So as many organisms that are being born are at the same rate pretty much of the ones that are dying out, so they're not overusing resources or having lots of competition within the community. Now on to 4 and 5 of our level of our biota. So our level 4 is our ecosystems. Ecosystems, especially marine, are fragile and vital for life on Earth, all right? So our marine ecosystems are very, very important to us. Some examples of that would be our coral reefs and our polar seas, which, as we've just talked about with our coral reefs, this is where we get most of our abundance of life in the oceans is found in the coral reefs. And our polar seas is where a lot of that upwelling occurs, where nutrient-rich waters are brought back to the surface after they've gone through the global conveyor belt. So these are two ecosystems that are very vital, not only to the marine ecosystem, but then life on Earth, because we depend on those marine ecosystems to bring us lots of food and nutrients. Changes, though, in the components of these ecosystems will have unpredictable effects, but ecosystems have remarkable ways of restoration. So among the scary time now, as we're dealing with COVID-19, there's been a lot of different news articles and images going out that while we all are in quarantine or, practicing social distancing, staying home, a lot of our environment is able to kind of get healthier and bounce back. So there's images in Venice and Italy, since people are not out in their canals, the water is now clear and there is marine life going in, lots of dolphins and sea turtles, and all type of things that haven't been around in years and years and years and years and years. So it's a pretty great thing to see. And then lastly, our very last biota is our biosphere, aka Mother Earth. All right, so the biosphere is composed of many ecosystems exhibiting great diversity that are related by the interdependence of living things, meaning that all living things depend on one another. All right, we're interdependent. We depend on one another to be able to exist and to thrive. All right, so that is it for our marine ecology overview.